My name is John, and with me this morning is Ryan.
Good morning.
Yeah, and not with us anymore are Benioff and Weiss, who are they've exited. Yes, they've left. Yes. Not to throw too much shade before we've even rolled into the episode, but I don't know if I could argue they were ever really with us necessarily as far as Star Wars goes, or that we were really with them. I wasn't anyway. I don't know, but they're out. Although, you know what? It's so easy to be like that now, isn't it? It's so easy now that they've quit to be like, oh, I never wanted them anyways. You know what I mean? Get out of here.
I had doubts. I was still optimistic. I was still hoping for the best.
Yeah. I realized as soon as I said that, I was like, well, that's not really true, because I heard the news that they were announced for the project, and I was like, oh, those guys. Okay, well, there's stuff about Game of Thrones I like. Maybe they'll do a good job with Star Wars,
Mm-hmm.
So I was hopeful, but it was, not going to lie, when I woke up to that text from Kevin telling me, or sharing the news story that they were out, it was a joyous feeling. And
yeah.
I think that kind of demonstrates like what my true feelings were about the whole situation, I suppose. Anyways, this is a big deal. We're going to talk a bunch about that and what we think is going on with the future of Star Wars as a result of this news. But we'll also talk about a new Mandalorian trailer, which came out on Monday of last week, so about 6 days ago now. And Ryan, I'm really excited to talk to you because you saw Knives Out on Halloween.
I did. Yeah, with Ryan Johnson in the audience.
Wow. Yeah. So I don't get to see it for a couple more weeks, like most of the rest of the world. There is a screening on a Friday night and a Saturday night the weekend before it comes out in, I think, most places, like a preview screening.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try to go to that, so that'll be soon. But not so soon that I want you to be telling us too much about the movie. But
no, I will not tell anything about the film because that's the way to experience it. Like, I would, if you haven't watched trailers yet, like, I know there was a final trailer, which I didn't watch. I would recommend not watching it. Ryan would recommend not watching it. Don't watch any trailers. Don't read any reviews. But we can talk more about it.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I almost feel like we just call this episode here. You know what I mean? We've sort of discussed. We didn't really get into the Mandalorian trailer at all.
Don't watch anything about it. Goodbye.
There you go. All right. No. So let's jump into this Benioff and Weiss news. I never knew how to spell Benioff's last name, and I don't know who DB is. I don't really know their names, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But now I feel like maybe I never will. I don't have to learn them necessarily. So,
yeah,
man, I just feel so rude this morning as I talk about Benioff and Weiss. I'm sure they're wonderful guys. Here's the story, okay? They made a deal with Lucasfilm to do a series of Star Wars movies, and the announcement came out Monday night. It was Monday night, right? Yeah. That they are walking away from that they're not going to do those movies. So this is the initial story, I think, was from Deadline. And I believe it was a situation where they prepared a statement, and Lucasfilm prepared a statement and sent them to Deadline, and Deadline published a story. So first thing they said is, we love Star Wars. When George Lucas built it, he built us too. Getting to talk about Star Wars with him and the current Star Wars team was the thrill of a lifetime, and we will always be indebted to the saga that changed everything. Well said. That line did kind of get me.
Yeah.
When George Lucas built Star Wars, he built us too. Well said. Kathleen Kennedy says that they're not shutting any doors. She says David Benioff and Dan Weiss, that's his name, David Benioff and Dan Weiss are incredible storytellers. We hope to include them in the journey forward when they're able to step away from their busy schedule to focus on Star Wars. Okay. And then the final quote from the Game of Thrones guys is, there are only so many hours in the day, and we felt we could not do justice to both Star Wars and our Netflix projects, so we are regretfully stepping away. As anyone would if they had, the option to do Star Wars or Netflix projects, like why wouldn't you walk away from Star Wars, right?
Well, 9 figures
Yes, that's true.
is
Yeah. But I wonder, like, I think about, like, Ryan Johnson, for instance, you know. I don't know what his fee was or what they paid him to make The Last Jedi. But I assume since it made, like, $900 million or whatever, like, in the U.S. alone, I assume that he made a lot of money from that movie. You know what I mean? Like, because they pay you to make it, but then I'm sure he got, like, a certain number of points or whatever, you know?
I don't know if we know that about Lucasfilm's inner
I'd be shocked if
workings.
he did not get any kind of participation in the movie doing really well at the box office, you know. I guess we don't know it for sure, but
Yeah.
I think that, I guess my point is that, yes, how many figures in the Netflix deal?
9.
9-figure Netflix deal is a lot of money and more than they would make from making a Star Wars movie, no doubt. But I feel like making a Star Wars movie, a successful one, or 3 successful Star Wars movies, has to pay pretty well too. So that's all I'm saying. But so what's your initial reaction to the news, Ryan? We have another story that we'll look at that kind of, it's like one of those Hollywood Trade Magazine insider stories where, hey, nobody's willing to go on record, but you can trust us because we're a reputable source, and people told us stuff. So we have one of those stories. But what's your reaction just to the initial, like, well, we love Star Wars, but we're just too busy to do Star Wars. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back because now my view on it has changed and evolved after more information and more anonymous sources have come out and told more of the story. I think, like, just my general feeling of the what if part of it is I was cautiously optimistic, but as you and I have talked about quite a bit over the past week, they probably weren't the best fit for Star Wars with the type of storytelling they do. And I think, like, you have to kind of get into some nuance there because, like, initially, and I think in, like, layman's terms, like, they are exactly the right fit for Star Wars. Like, they do, if you think of Star Wars just as, like, big budget, epic storytelling in, like, a fantasy setting, like, yeah, like, who else is there? Like, yeah, those are the guys in 2019. But then, like, once you start to dig a little deeper and, like, really look at, how they presented and told the story in Game of Thrones, and then especially looking at their panel appearance when they were talking about, like, the making of Game of Thrones, you start to kind of, like, see, like, some things that are maybe not, like, aligned with what we expect out of Star Wars. I think their approach to thematic elements, when you compare that to like what Ryan did in Last Jedi, like, it's not even really a comparison. And I think, like, when I think back on Game of Thrones, like, I think about, like, the experience of it, and, like, every week not knowing what's going to happen next, constantly, like, being ready to be, like, shocked and possibly disgusted, and, all the discourse around it. And, like, it started to, in, those, towards the end there, like, it started to feel more just like a reality TV show, like, experience with, like, the Twitter conversations and everything. And it was just like, oh, who's gonna die this week, who's gonna live, like, who's gonna betray who. It really, like, boiled down to a lot of, like, I think, like, superficial elements that kept people hooked. And, like, the hooks were good. Like, I was like on the edge of my seat for, like, all of that last season, but But then, like, you know, after being like a little bit removed, like, no one's talking about the last season of Game of Thrones. People weren't talking about it 2 weeks after. Like, there's nothing to like unpack there or anything. I'm sure there's like some corner of the internet where people are still like scouring through it, but like that ship has sailed. Like, no one is like, you know, there's no discourse around it there because there's nothing really to say about it at this point. And I think that's kind of like just on like a basic level, kind of like you were saying, like I was cautiously optimistic, but now I feel a sense of relief, and I think that's probably closer to like my true feeling.
Yeah, no, and I mean, like, yeah, man, Game of Thrones, I think, definitely a successful show. There's a lot of things about it that are really good. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Game of Thrones. I liked it. I watched it when it was on. But I mean, I don't want to take anything away from Game of Thrones because obviously it was like this cultural phenomenon. It was a very big deal. Mm-hmm. But it's a lot more superficial entertainment than like a Star Wars saga film is, I think, in a lot of ways. And like you said, you know, the fact that it's kind of already disappeared from the discourse, and all the prequel shows that they had been putting together for Game of Thrones seem to be disappearing from reality also. They did announce one, right? But
yeah, one got canceled, one got announced.
No, but I was reading about it, and there were like, I think 6 prequel shows in development in the Game of Thrones universe or whatever, like at HBO.
Whoa.
Yeah, they announced just like, oh, we're going to do like 1 million, which is not that far from what Lucasfilm seems to do to a certain degree as well, which, you know, like we'll announce stuff the second we think of it, you know what I mean? And then find out like down the road, oh, well, actually, never mind. Although I guess with Lucasfilm, part of the problem is that they don't even have to announce things and we already know they're making them. So for instance, like the James Mangold Boba Fett movie, which they never said they were going to do, but you know, people found out, right? So now it's like, oh, here's another thing that didn't come to pass. Well, they never said it would, you know what I mean? So, but there have been other things like this, obviously, and Colin Trevorrow on episode 9 and lots of stuff like that. And we haven't talked about it on the show, and I don't want to talk about it right now, but it sounds like there was a close call there with the Cassian Andor series as well, where that almost like potentially wasn't going to work out, and hopefully it does and it works out well and everything. So, yeah, I guess making Star Wars movies and TV shows is a dangerous business or whatever, you know. What does he say? Werner Herzog there. Bounty hunting is a dangerous profession. Is that what he says? A dangerous profession?
Yeah.
Something like that. But I mean, to circle back to why I started talking words out loud, is that I think they just didn't seem equipped to make the kind of to do the kind of storytelling that is significant enough to carry on the Star Wars legacy. It's a big deal. You know, what they were going to do is apparently it was going to be the origin of the Jedi Order is what like word is on the street this week in some of these articles is that's what they were looking to do, kind of tell the Jedi origin story, which maybe sounds like even further back than the Knights of the Old Republic type thing, obviously, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So they were thinking about going way back. That's heavy stuff. And not only that, but Bob Iger and Disney and whoever have said no more Star Wars films until 2022, which means this isn't just like, oh, well, yeah, we've got, you know, episode 9 coming out next year, and then there's a Rogue One type movie, and maybe we'll do a Solo 2, and then also these guys are going to do the origins of the Jedi Order. This is like Star Wars stops for 3 years, and when it comes back, these guys are it's almost like I mean, not even close to the same level, but almost like a J.J. Abrams type task with The Force Awakens, where it's like we've got to reset and restart and set the tone going forward. And like, are the guys who did Game of Thrones, which is a kind of mean-spirited, very like violent, heavy on shock factor, you know, kind of show, are they the ones who are the right people to kind of, you know, make the first series of films in like Star Wars era 2.0 or whatever you'd call it, you know? I don't know. It didn't ever seem like that would be the right fit. And then the other thing is like, you know, again, I don't want to disparage them too much. I don't know that much about them, but primarily it seems like by their own admission after that talk in Austin or whatever it was, that essentially all they've done is Game of Thrones. And you're taking, I mean, I shouldn't say just, because I couldn't do it, and I'm not saying it's not a difficult thing, but they're taking this book and this series that somebody else created, and they're adapting it for television. That seems like a completely different task than we're going to kind of set the bar for what Star Wars will be and kind of kick off a new era in Star Wars storytelling. And we're going to be the ones to tell a story as important as like this, the origin of the Jedi Order. It just seems quite different, you know? And so, yes, we were able to make this TV show that got people talking around the water cooler every Monday morning. And, you know, that's a big deal, but I don't know that they are really equitable, or they're really comparable tasks. So.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, and I think it's also worth noting that they're, you know, I think it's widely considered that the stuff where they collaborated with George R.R. Martin and like adapted his, you know, work with also him like co-writing and directing episodes and stuff was the high point of Game of Thrones. And when they were sort of left to their own devices is where things started to fall apart and continued to.
Yeah. Yeah, and man, I don't even want to relitigate the final season of Game of Thrones. Definitely not. But I will just say, as negative as I've sounded on them, as down as I sound on them, as mean as I kind of was about being like, hey, I was thrilled to wake up to that news. For me, watching the last season of Game of Thrones, like there were just like really key choices made in that season that I very strongly disagreed with. Mm-hmm. But like it was like, I guess what I'm trying to say is I felt like they were like 80% of the way there, but that 20% that they did not accomplish was like the critical stuff.
Yeah.
And I can't have that with Star Wars, like with the new series of Star Wars movies that are going to be like, you know, creating the future for Star Wars. I can't have it be like some guys that are pretty good, but you know, like
they can't stick the landing.
Can't stick the landing, or worse than that, even like would choose a landing that sends a lot of the wrong messages and doesn't have a vision, doesn't have like, I don't feel like there's a lot of heart in Game of Thrones, you know? And maybe that's not fair to say, but it doesn't, to me, it just doesn't feel like a show with a ton of heart. And like, I need Star Wars to have that. So,
well, that's kind of like a nebulous concept, though. Like it's pretty subjective.
All right, I don't think Game of Thrones has a lot of warmth, and Star Wars needs to have that. Let's put it that way, maybe.
Yeah.
Because I guess you can have a lot of heart in making something cold and cynical, if that's what your intention is to make.
Well, but I think people would point to like the Stark family and the relationship between the girls and stuff as like the emotional core of Game of Thrones. And, but
for Game of Thrones. For Game of in that universe, sure, there it is.
It's a very small fire in a very cold expanse.
Exactly. Yeah. No, they're not emotionless. They're not, you know. But yeah, I'm not. I don't know. I struggled to see how that was gonna. Or I definitely had some skepticism as far as those guys doing it. So, and you know, you have to wonder like. Well, we have this whole article from Hollywood Reporter that's trying to dig into why they bailed. So
I'm ready to jump into the juicy stuff.
Okay, yeah, because I was going to say, I was just getting ready to kick off like a whole hypothesis and stuff, and it's like, well, this article kind of does that. So why don't we just talk about what they have put forth and consider it? So we'll link to it. It's called Why the Game of Thrones Duo Bailed on Star Wars, and it's from Boris Kitt and... who is the name on there that I'm familiar with, but then there's also
Leslie
let's
Goldberg.
not do the thing where I name one. Leslie Goldberg, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the articles from that's on Hollywood Reporter. It'll be linked to in our notes. Man, this first bit of news, Ryan, is the thing where I started reading this article and I was like, okay, yes, I'm going to read this whole article, no doubt, because it kicked off with this little anecdote about the fact that last summer, or like this previous summer that just passed, Benioff and Weiss went to Italy, partially because they were going to visit, or they did visit, George Lucas and in the process of doing research for their trilogy of films that they were going to make for Star Wars.
Yeah.
Whoa. And that's part of what they said too when they were like, we're out. Is like, man, getting to talk to George Lucas about Star Wars, like, it was worth stringing Disney along for the last 2 years or whatever just for that, just to be able to talk to George.
Hey, if that's what it takes.
No, I mean, just like just to picture that in my mind, like, I don't know if he's in Lake Como or where he is, but just like, we're just going to fly over and then go, sit down with George, and it's going to be this gorgeous Italian, landscape and backdrop. And there's George in his flannel shirt and jeans and his shout out to Blast Points, because they always point out the exact model, but wearing his Nike Monarchs and, sit there and talk to him. I mean, what a picturesque setting and concept, like, man. But also just no, go ahead.
Well, I'm just wondering, like, so we've had the conversations about, like, and I think Force Material did an excellent deep dive on this, like, about how involved George is in Star Wars these days, and how he was, in the Disney era. And so, like, it's an interesting question to me. Like, I wonder if, like, Benioff and Weiss, knowing that, like, they do their best work when it's dictated to them by old white men, like, I wonder if they were going to bring George more to the forefront here, if they were going to try to get him in there, like.
That's an interesting idea, especially if it was like they were like, okay, let's work with George on this and try to get him a little bit involved in our process, because I think, as the Bob Iger excerpt from his book points out, and as we kind of already knew anyways, but we just got more details, like, that ship had sailed as far as George being super involved in this trilogy, like 7, 8, and 9. But that was kind of the original plan, is for him to be, creatively involved, not helming it, but creatively involved. So I was like, well, JJ pissed me off, so I'm not doing it. But maybe, hey, these guys, I visited the Game of Thrones set when they were doing season 8.
Yeah.
I know these guys, and like, hey, maybe they're not as much of assholes as I don't think George is or JJ is an asshole. But,
I don't think
maybe George
so
does.
I think
maybe George does a little bit because
really
he
nice
pushed him out, or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
I don't even think he thinks that. They seem to have a playful relationship at this point, whatever. But my point is just like, maybe he was like, oh, yeah, I can work with these guys. But what if, and this is just wild speculation and not likely true at all, but what if it was like they go and they meet with George, and George is like, oh, this sucks. Like, you guys, like, no way am I working with you on this. And they were like, okay, never mind. George hates our Star Wars idea. Let's just go do our Netflix shows. You know what I mean?
I don't think they would have been, like, talking about how awesome it was talking to George Lucas.
I would. Oh, yeah? If I wanted, if I was going to make a Star Wars movie and George was like, you suck, like, you are not making Star Wars, I would be like,
holy
okay,
crap.
It was awesome to meet George. It was awesome to meet him,
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
Could you be mad at George Lucas if he didn't like your Star Wars idea? Like, could you really be like, oh, screw you, George. Like, my idea is better than yours about Star Wars. Like, you know what I mean? You couldn't.
No, of course not.
Even those guys couldn't be mad at George about that, I don't feel like.
That's fair. I mean,
I don't know.
Okay, yeah.
It's probably not what happened, but actually I saw that quote and I thought, I like where your head is, but I looked at it and I just thought, is George kind of more involved in all of this than we know? You know what I mean? Like,
is he the Palpatine of this all?
No, I don't think he's that. But what I mean is, like, is he? They had the whole, like, they set out the thing where it's like, well, he'll be a consultant on these movies and he's going to be involved and he'll be in the credits and all that. And I wonder if it's the thing where he's like, well, I'm not committing to anything and I'm not going to be officially involved, but at the same time, like, I want to know what you guys are doing. I want to give feedback on what you're doing. And, maybe every time they do, because JJ made a comment recently, I can't remember where or when, but he made a comment about how they were talking to George about what they're doing in episode 9, and George going to him during the writing process, or I think even before the writing process, and talking to George. So I just wonder if all these guys, I bet Ron Howard for sure was talking to George while he was making Solo.
Well, yeah. I mean, George was
probably Lawrence
on
Kasdan.
the set.
Yeah. Well,
Solo.
yeah, but he kind of seems to always do the ceremonial set visits to the movies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he directed a scene. I mean, directed a scene.
I was going to say, you know how I like to get pedantic and real technical about specific diction that we use here, but I feel like whoever wrote that article chose to use that term, and then now it's become canon that George directed the scene when it's like, oh, he told him not to do something with a cape or whatever. It was like, oh, he directed that scene. Did he tell the cameras where to set up? Did he, I don't think.
He got the DP in position. Yeah.
It may be. I don't know. But anyway, I love the idea that George is like involved in some level. And I do think the fact that we're starting a new kind of era and a new trilogy and a whole different story outside of the saga could be like a really good opportunity for George to have some decent involvement in whatever it is they're going to do.
Yeah. And I think no matter what your ego is as a filmmaker or producer or anything, like, if you were making a Star Wars trilogy set about the origins of the Jedi Order, like, wouldn't you at least just want to know what George's thoughts on that are? Like, if you could, like,
right.
yeah, like, unless you were, like, forbidden from, doing that, or like George just didn't want to. But I think if George will talk about most things, it seems. So
So, and I mean, like, I could see where George would be like, well, you're making your Rogue One movie, whatever, I'm not that concerned about who built the Death Star. Or maybe a young Han Solo movie, I could see him wanting to be more involved in that. Actually, he got the ball rolling on that. He's the one who greenlit that movie, basically.
Yeah.
Although conspiracy theorists don't want to ever acknowledge or believe that, but it's true. George is the one who made that choice and hired Lawrence Kasdan to write it, etc. But those are smaller in scope and smaller in impact, I think, on the overall lore of Star Wars. And this seems like it would have been pretty big in scope and impact, and so it just seems like something that he maybe would want to be involved in. So I don't know. It's interesting. It's also interesting if Rian Johnson ends up doing the next trilogy of Star Wars movies, which would be, I'm sure, his own unique thing and not related to what Benioff and Weiss were going to do. But it'd be interesting to see if there would be a similar potential for a collaboration with Rian Johnson and George. I've heard conflicting reports about what George Lucas thinks about The Last Jedi. I don't know, but
yeah. And I mean, I still am, like, we've talked about this a lot, but I feel like Rian Johnson is the most George Lucas of everyone involved in Star Wars right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. And for sure. And that's one of the things with the Benioff and Weiss deal in the first place is, like, to me, actually, we said this recently on an episode. I can't remember how many episodes, how many episodes back it was and why we were talking about it. But I remember being like, I'm going to be super mad if it turns out they're not doing the Rian Johnson movies and they're doing the Benioff and Weiss movies instead. And I was like saying, you have the opportunity to work with, like, this visionary, genius, original filmmaker, or these Game of Thrones dudes, and you're going to toss out the opportunity to work with Rian Johnson so you can make movies with these Game of Thrones guys. I was going to be, like, livid about that, and it's because, like, Rian Johnson, he seems like a visionary. He seems like an extremely original, unique voice. Like, his voice is strong. You can probably comment on that more when we get to Knives Out.
Yeah.
But I think you're watching a Rian Johnson movie when you watch a Rian Johnson movie.
And I think, like, if you are listening to this podcast and you're not a fan of The Last Jedi, like, well, first of all, wow. Like, it's amazing you're still listening to our show. But, I mean, I think, like, once you see Knives Out, like, this guy kind of knows what he's doing.
Ooh, okay. All right. Cool. Well, we're circling back to Knives Out. But all right, that was like 10, 15, 20 minutes on one bullet point, so we should keep moving. Sources tell Hollywood Reporter that Benioff and Weiss's exit has been brewing since August, and that Kathleen Kennedy is said to have been unhappy with the Netflix deal, just as they were scheduled to begin work on Star Wars. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, you know?
Mm-hmm.
We we signed you guys as you were finishing up Game of Thrones, and we announced the project and said they're not going to work on it until they finish Game of Thrones. That's what they're doing, but then when they're done with that, the priority will become Star Wars. Like, that was the belief, I think, of us, like fans, and it seems to be what maybe Lucasfilm believed too. So for them to finish up Game of Thrones and then be like, well, we got to strike while the iron is hot and sign some huge development deal somewhere else, it's like, wait a minute, I thought you guys said you loved Star Wars and you couldn't wait to do Star Wars, and like you were so excited to have the opportunity to do Star Wars, but really you want to do Star Wars and 10 other things because you want to become the next like mogul producing team that, you know, like you want to create your own bad robot or whatever. Like, good for you, but you know, we don't want to be one of 10 things you're juggling. Like,
yeah. And I mean, yeah, and you've got to like, you know, you've got to wonder what there isn't like a ton of talk about the Netflix side of things here, but you've also got to wonder, like, in that deal, when obviously they knew what they were getting, but they're like, okay, we're giving you 9 figures and you won't be ready to fully commit to these projects for 10 years if you're doing like a trilogy, basically.
Well, I mean, there is a quote in the article from someone at Netflix, or, you know, anonymous source at Netflix or whatever, where they said, like, it's not like they won't be able to deliver us anything for 10 years, but it's because the Netflix deal was that they would be working concurrently on Star Wars and Netflix stuff. So they want to juggle two different things. They want to, like, I mean, Netflix probably looking at it like, okay, Benioff and Weiss are signed to do Star Wars. Like, that's definitely happening. But can we sign them to a long-term deal where they'll work with us while they're working on Star Wars, and then when they're done with Star Wars, they'll continue working with us? That seems like a better deal for Netflix than it does for Disney or for Lucasfilm, because you're coming in and you're taking their attention away from where it would already be and getting some of it for yourself. Versus if I'm Lucasfilm, I'm looking at that and saying, wait, you said you were going to work with us, and now you want to take me roller skating on Friday, but then you want to go roller skating with somebody else on Saturday? Like, are we exclusive or are we not? You know what I mean? That's like how I look at it.
Sorry, millennial listeners who have no idea what that metaphor was.
Because monogamy is dead for millennials, or because roller skating is dead?
Roller skating.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Gotcha. Did you know about cuffing season, Ryan?
No.
Oh, I just learned about that. Well, I actually learned about it like a year or two ago, but it's an interesting cultural development among teenagers. Apparently in the winter months, that's called cuffing season, and you want to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend or whatever that is committed to you, so you have someone to like hang out with and stuff when it's like all bad weather and everything. So you want to cuff somebody, handcuff them. You want to cuff somebody before the weather gets bad. But then like when spring comes around, it starts to warm up again, then, you know, people break up with the cuffs come off. You break up with whoever you were dating, and then you start playing the field again. Cuffing season. Yeah, isn't that wild?
That is, man.
Never participated in that myself, but because it didn't exist. But you know, I mean, there's also the politics between Disney and Netflix as far as like they both have. I mean, they're both streaming giants now, right?
Yeah.
And Disney is like betting so much on Disney Plus, and like, do you really want these people that you're working with like setting the tone for Star Wars going forward, being super critically important to Star Wars, to be, you know,
employed by the other guys,
giving half of their attention to your like your enemy in this streaming TV war or whatever? You know, it just doesn't make a lot of sense from that level either. Yeah,
and I mean, like, I guess it's probably possible to, you know, like, we know JJ has like a million projects going on and stuff.
Yeah.
But you know, when you know, there was a Q&A um, after the Knives Out screening with Ryan, and he said like one of the things that was great about Knives Out is he did it in a year.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that Last Jedi was 4 years of like his full commitment. And so when you think about that, like, like 3 of those films, and I mean, he did Last Jedi fully committed to it, but I mean, I guess you can be less committed, but
yeah, and the 4-year number is like a little bit confusing to me, because it's like, well, we read like the Art of the Last Jedi, and we know like he was at Lucasfilm in like 2015, I think, really starting to do big time research. I guess I'd have to go back and look at the book for sure.
Yeah.
But I feel like it was more like a 3-year process making The Last Jedi. Because it came out in
words,
2017.
man.
I know, but maybe he means like from when he first started talking to Lucasfilm about doing it and stuff.
But not
being completely
writing
like
it, and
yeah, but that's what I'm saying. Like, I think he wrote that movie pretty quickly too. It doesn't matter. Whatever. He put a lot of time into it. And the thing is, like,
but he didn't produce anything else in that
exactly.
time period.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think even JJ, like you said, he's got a lot of things going on at all times, but he runs this giant production company, Bad Robot, and there's a lot of people that work there and a lot of people that work for him. And I think with The Force Awakens, you read like The Art of The Force Awakens or just listen to JJ talk about making that movie. I don't know, man. I don't know that I don't think he was too invested in other things once he started making Star Wars. I mean, I do know that when he was writing The Force Awakens, like him and Lawrence Kasdan he said that they would like kind of broke the script by walking around in different cities around the world and stuff, while like going on these long walks and talking and figuring out the story. And maybe they were in all these different places because of other projects JJ was still finishing up or, kind of committed to or whatever early in that process. But I think once he got into it, he was focused. And the one person that I know of who I do know was split as far as his resources and dedication and stuff goes is Colin Trevorrow, because I know he was doing half a day on Jurassic World or whatever it was, and then half a day on Star Wars. And that always seemed to be like one of those things too, where it's like, dude, how can you be making the new Star Wars movie and putting half of your day into it? You know what I mean? And I'm not a big Hollywood director. I don't work in Hollywood. I don't know like how that stuff all shakes out, but it just seems like, I suppose the other side of that coin is, how can you be a young protege of Steven Spielberg who's been tasked with like carrying on one of his franchises and be like, well, see ya, I'm out. I mean, I guess if you're spending half your day working with Steven Spielberg and his company and half your day working with Lucasfilm, maybe that does make sense. But but there's not a good track record for people who are like kind of like, well, I'll give part of my time to Star Wars. I guess that's my point.
And there's like JJ I'm looking at his IMDb right now, and he has a ton of producer credits between like 2012 and all the way up through like basically like the rest of his life is basically planned out on IMDb here. Like, they just stop listing dates at 2022 and there's still like 10 projects at the top of the page. But yeah, like he has a lot of producer credits in the Disney era, but not much, like nothing in writer and director.
Yeah, and I think it's because he's got this whole like operation that he is the head of, and that he like is the creative lead for at Bad Robot. But then like, he's got like there's production teams and teams of people within that kind of like, it's like Lost. He wrote the pilot, directed the pilot, worked a little bit on the first season, and then like set that. He was still producer, but he wasn't doing the day-to-day on Lost, which is why it's crazy when people are like, oh, he couldn't stick a landing. He was like so uninvolved.
He was so far removed.
I know, yeah, and it's just like...
Put that on Lindelof.
Right. But yeah, there's this bullet point here. Adding to the wrinkle was that, according to one source, the Netflix deal required them to be exclusively on the sets of the projects they created during production and not be away for Star Wars at the same time. Which, again, if you want to look at this more from the perspective of, is this some kind of weird power struggle between Disney and Netflix? I mean, that seems like a relevant factor right there. yeah, we're gonna sign you this 9-figure deal, but just so you know, like when you're doing Netflix stuff, you're doing Netflix stuff, and we're not sharing you with Disney. And if you're Disney on the other side of that deal, going, wait, we signed these guys last year. How are they now all of a sudden deciding that they're gonna be, that they're gonna be like giving more time to this other woman than they are to us?
$250 million is a lot of money.
Another thing we didn't talk about, the time in the Netflix pact, Benioff and Weiss were working on a treatment for Disney and Lucasfilm. The pair was committed to it penning at least one of the films, though the original deal was to write all three. And just a lot of these little nuggets of information make me wonder, like, did they, kind of go in and pitch, or maybe they didn't have to pitch considering where they were with Game of Thrones, but did they go in and talk to Lucasfilm in 2018 and say, we want to do 3 Star Wars movies, we're going to write them, it's going to be awesome, like we can't wait. And then as the reality of trying to create new, meaningful, impactful Star Wars set in, it was like less and less that they were willing to commit to it. You know what I mean? Not because it was like, oh, well, not only because, hey, we're going to get $250 million from Netflix, but maybe also because, whoa, this is hard. And like, I don't know if we are as able to do this as we thought we were. You know what I mean? Is it a possibility that as the reality of creating new Star Wars and creating new Star Wars that's good enough to feel proud of, the reality of that process sets in? Is it one of those things where it's like, well, let's start looking for exit plans. Let's start looking for, because I bet in 2018 when they made this deal, they weren't thinking that they were going to try to sign some 10-year deal with some other development place as soon as Game of Thrones ended. You know what I mean? But maybe as it got closer to actually doing Star Wars, and it's a lot easier to say you're going to do something than actually do it,
Yeah.
And I just wonder if it was like, man, maybe we should start looking at other things. And because it would be, last thing real quick, it would be, I think, pretty tough on your career. I think this is already going to maybe be kind of tough on their career, but if you do Game of Thrones and it's not that well received, the ending of it, and then the next big thing that happens in your career is that you quit Star Wars, what does that look like? Versus you do the Netflix or you do the Game of Thrones final season, it's not that well received, but just as that's bombing or whatever you want to say, you get this big win, $250 million, Netflix, 10 years, multiple projects. Like, that's a big win. We're power players. And then after that big win, okay, but we're not going to do Star Wars anymore. Like, to me, that's a way different story than Game of Thrones last season sucked, and also we just quit Star Wars. Yeah. Now somebody signed us to a $250 million deal.
Yeah.
Your cultural cachet and your ability to sit at the table and make that deal, I think, would be significantly hit by quitting Star Wars before you do some other deal. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, and I don't know these guys. I don't really know who they are as people, aside from, a pretty revealing panel at Austin Film Festival, which is like their first public appearance because they canceled their, I believe it was the San Diego Comic-Con panel after.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a farewell panel.
Yeah, they canceled that. So I don't know how cynical these dudes are. But like, yeah, like they signed that deal in February of 2018 when the last season of Game of Thrones was like more hotly anticipated than anything Star Wars. Yeah. Like, I mean, like, I think now it's like, hindsight's 2020 and people are like, oh yeah, remember Game of Thrones? Yeah, that kind of sucked at the end. But like at that time, like that wait between those two like half seasons, like that was, I mean, people were talking about that for like years.
Yeah.
Like, oh man, it's coming. We're X amount of days now. It's happening this year. It's coming. It was like the hype was insane. And that was after like even some rough patches in the last season and a half. So yeah, they were in such a good place to bargain then, and like I don't know. It's weird to me, kind of, that like it's weird thinking of like someone like Kathy Kennedy being like swept up in the hype of anything. And but like, I mean, Game of Thrones was a cultural phenomenon in the same way Jurassic World was a shocking phenomenon.
Yeah,
That it's one of like
success, yeah.
the like top 10 highest grossing movies ever, which
Yeah.
I don't think anyone expected from a like the fifth Jurassic Park movie, like, or fourth, I don't know. Um yeah, and so like when she got people like Colin Trevorrow and Benioff and Weiss, like I guess like there was a time where people like these guys seemed like the future of like blockbusters, and then the reality is like, I think both in the case of Colin Trevorrow and Benioff and Weiss, is they got kind of lucky, and they, in the same way like George got kind of lucky with A New Hope. Like there were a lot of things that could have gone wrong there, and a lot of things that were wrong until like the very last minute, but it was thanks to like the cast, the composer, the all these like little factors that made it a hit. And I don't know, it's just interesting to think about that. And I'm kind of rambling here, but I think like they had, like you said, so much cultural cachet in 2018, and then I think getting them that $250 million, I think it was a power play by Netflix. I think, like, and this is like the most cynical thing possible, like I think they wanted, like, Star Wars, and by extension Disney and Disney Plus, to be less successful.
Yeah, steal the star players away from your competitor.
Yeah.
As a blow to them. Right. Yeah, potentially. I
mean, like, even if like I also think there's a good chance that maybe the Benioff and Weiss Star Wars films would not have been as much of a hit as like fans or like commercially people wanted them to be. But even just, and like I think that was probably a factor to consider, like, well, what if they like make these Star Wars films and they like suck and like make people really mad and it totally kills Star Wars? Like, well, that could be good for us, but on like the Netflix side of things.
Yeah.
But like at the same time, like just throwing that wrench in the gears, I think was enough, because that just like, I mean, it just messed up Lucasfilm's film slate like extremely.
Yeah, and there's so much to I mean, one thing that you just mentioned there that I'll touch on quickly, but I always wonder with writer directors, or specifically with Colin Trevorrow and Benioff and Weiss, it's like I think like a Rian Johnson. And I actually don't. I love to gush about Rian Johnson a ton, but like I feel like we're really doing that a lot this episode, but because I like to, fine. But you look at him and it's like, well, yeah, that he writes his movies, he directs his movies, and it's a total like creative vision, and that's what he should be doing. Like you don't get the like, oh wow, it would be great if Rian Johnson would direct somebody else's script. I mean, it just seems like an odd choice. Like it's like the idea of Wes Anderson directing somebody else's script or something. Like he always writes his movies and he directs them, and it's just like it's what he does. Sofia Coppola, whatever. But then like I look at like Colin Trevorrow or Benioff and Weiss, and like Jurassic World, I like that movie. Okay, you know what I mean? But there were definitely kind of like Game of Thrones season 8. There was times where it was like, but that's the choice you made. Like that's where the story's going, or like whatever, But like Jurassic World to me was a lot like Force Awakens in the sense that like I sat down to watch that movie and I was like, well, this is a modern Jurassic Park, but it really like the feel, you know what I mean? Like the moment to moment
movie experience really feels like what it should for a Jurassic World movie, or a Jurassic Park movie, or in the case of The Force Awakens, a Star Wars movie. And like, to me, that's direction, right? Like, or that's a big part of what the directing job would be, is like creating the feeling and the tone and all that stuff. And I feel like Trevorrow did a really good job with that with Jurassic World. And but then I'm like, some of the writing stuff, you're like, okay. And then it's kind of same thing with Game of Thrones potentially too. It's like, these guys undoubtedly have talent, you know what I mean? And they took this and they adapted it and they made it into something really impressive. But at the same time, like, does that mean that like every director needs to also like write their own stuff? Like, or would a Colin Trevorrow or a Benioff and Weiss be better off like directing movies that other like really talented screenwriters who don't direct movies, wrote, and then they come in and collaborate with those people, versus, well, I want to be the next, whoever, so I am gonna write my movies and direct them. Not everybody has that, maybe, I don't know. Not everybody has that strength, and so I guess I've always been more concerned about Benioff and Weiss writing the Star Wars movies than I necessarily was about them directing it. Not that I was super thrilled about either, but the writing thing seems to be where my concern would be, kind of more with both of those kind of guys, so I don't know. But what else? Bullied as well. Benioff and Weiss, part of the argument here, and this makes a lot of sense. I mean, it makes a ton of sense, and it's something that'll come up when we talk about Knives Out too. Part of the argument here, apparently for these guys, was, well, we took so much heat for Game of Thrones, and we just saw we've seen how Star Wars fans are online to people they don't like. Do we really want to set ourselves up for more abuse from fans? The source close to Benioff and Weiss says that their thought process was basically, who wants to go through that again? Not them. This was in the life's too short category. I mean, could you blame them? I don't know.
Yeah. I wonder if I don't know. I feel like Benioff and Weiss got a lot of flack. I don't think either of them are on social media necessarily. I don't think I've ever seen them in any capacity, but they got, I feel like what Benioff and Weiss got was like criticized. They had their work critiqued. And I think some of it was like, I saw some severe stuff, like directed at the work, and I guess like by extension directed at them. I mean, I think like the Star Wars, because there's also, there's critique and criticism of The Last Jedi. And then there's also, like, weird Gamergate stuff of, like, like, racist and misogynist and homophobes and, like, these just, like, awful people who are, like, coming out of the woodwork to, like, harass and, make stuff up and, like, just be like huge dicks. And I think like, I don't know if there was much of that for Game of Thrones. Like,
yeah, no, I don't know.
I didn't, and I think like I'm not that close. Like I'm not part of the Game of Thrones fandom, I guess. Like I don't, listen to podcasts or go on like message boards or like, I'm not on Game of Thrones Twitter, even though for a while it felt like everyone was on Game of Thrones Twitter.
Yeah.
In the same way, like I'm involved with Star Wars, but like I don't think I like ever really saw any of that.
Yeah, maybe not, but at the same time, it's like, well, we can go to Netflix and make whatever projects we want to make and not have it have all this weight attached to it, or we can try to tackle something else that people already have strong attachment to, and then if you disappoint them,
it's this big deal where you let people down versus I don't know what they're going to do at Netflix, but if it's not adapting stuff that people are already in love with, then, you know, maybe they make a crappy show and people just move on with their lives versus you make a crappy Star Wars trilogy and it, you know, it's going to take me a while to get over it. I have to tell you, I'm not going to harass them. I'm not going to yell at them on the internet, but I'm going to be extremely disappointed. And, you know, even if Game of Thrones fans weren't chasing them down and harassing them and abusing them and, you know, all that stuff, it must feel awful to disappoint the whole world. You know what I mean? And I'm serious about that. And so imagine the pressure. We talked about it with JJ. We talked about it when we were talking about the George Lucas story from the Bob Iger book. Mm-hmm. Imagine the pressure of carrying on Star Wars, you know? Imagine the pressure of that. I mean, JJ had done Star Trek and was pretty successful with it, you know? Mm-hmm. I know a lot of people didn't like Into Darkness, right? Was that one a little bit disappointing to people?
It was awesome. I don't know if it
was but I think it didn't get some backlash or something?
Yeah.
But not as much as the Simon Pegg one, which really people didn't like, I think, right? The third one?
Beyond. No, that was like I think that was James Wan. I think it was like the Fast and
Simon
Furious
Pegg wrote it though, right?
Maybe.
It doesn't matter. But
yeah,
anyway.
I think like no one really cared about the third one is really what happened.
Okay. But I mean, like, he had done Star Trek and he'd been successful with it, you know, and he'd been successful with a lot of things, and then it's like, I'm going to go into Star Wars and I think I can do this. And he did it and it was awesome. But imagine like if JJ had just had the biggest show in the world on TV and it just ended and the whole world was like, you know, loved him so much. And then all of a sudden decided he was the worst. And that was his that was his headspace going into making The Force Awakens. That just seems like a really different thing than, you know, wow, we put out season 8 of Game of Thrones, the one that we are most directly responsible for setting the direction for story-wise, and people hated it. And now we're supposed to create a new Star Wars trilogy, and we already know that people get pretty feisty about Star Wars. And, you know, I feel like that would be really difficult. And the next quote here says, and we're almost done with this article, but whether forces internal or external were in play, Benioff and Weiss wanted out. It was a hard quit, says the insider. So, like, no, we are done. We are not doing this. Like, we're out is how I interpret that. And it just kind of seems like that, you know, makes sense to me on a lot of levels. Like, I can empathize with these guys and I can see where maybe they would have just thought it's not worth it. And partially because of a lack of confidence, which I think you could say like, oh, well, you know, they're not talented enough, so they weren't confident in themselves. Or you could also just look at it like more empathetically, which is kind of how I'm feeling about it as we talk about it, which is just like, it would be really painful to biff on the last season of Game of Thrones the way they did. And then to go into that with I mean, there would just be so much pressure to do Star Wars anyway, to do it right, and to go into that, like, I don't know. So anyway, we don't really know what happened, but there's some people speculating too that like really it was Lucasfilm who was like, we're not sure we want you to do this anymore, but we're going to let you shop around and get your Netflix deal and all that, and then we'll let you go. Who knows? I don't know how Hollywood works. That seems pretty disingenuous and fraudulent. Like, I can't imagine that Disney and Lucasfilm would be like, well, you're not going to work for us. Like, we don't think you're good enough, but we will allow you to pretend you're good enough while you ink some giant deal with some other company. Like, we'll basically help you trick another company into paying you more than you're worth. Maybe that happens in Hollywood all the time, but that seems kind of far-fetched to me. It does. It seems kind of far-fetched to me. I mean, wanting to protect somebody's career or trying to do it in a way where it's not going to be a ton of egg on their face or whatever, I can see. Yeah. But hard to believe that, because the speculation I saw about that was like, oh yeah, Kathleen Kennedy and they knew like earlier this year, like around Celebration time, they were like, oh yeah, no, these guys suck. We're not working with them, but we'll let them pretend they're working with us to like sign some other giant deal. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the other juicy rumor is like towards the end of Game of Thrones season 8, Lucasfilm started rethinking it. I saw that. And Yeah, I don't know.
That one, I mean, of course it's possible, but it also just seems like the kind of like made up fan speculation rumor that writes itself. You know what I mean? So it's like one of those things.
Well, but there is kind of a precedent for that though, because like with Josh Trank when Fantastic Four was like the hottest mess in Hollywood, that's when Lucasfilm started having their doubts. And then when Colin Trevorrow's like next feature completely bombed, they started having doubts as well. Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, the Trank thing, if rumors are to be believed, he like lost his ability to be professional while making the Fantastic Four, and was a train wreck on the set. And so, I mean, I guess that's kind of the same thing, but it's not one of those things where it's like, oh well, people didn't like the movie he made, so let's get rid of him. It was like, no, he has demonstrated himself to be not trustworthy. Well, and I mean that was a story before that movie even came out. Like troubled production, was there, but also like, Josh Trank, I think, is like one of the most interesting stories from Hollywood. Like he was like this prodigy, like super young. God, like when he was directing Fantastic Four, he was still in his 20s. And then he basically just like cracked under the pressure, which, God, like I would have on the first day of something like that in my 20s. But then like he's gone on to like make smaller films and that have been like well received, and he's like super happy, and he's like, basically this was like the best thing that could have happened to me. Yeah, because he had to kind of get his life together, right? I think is sort of the deal. Like he kind of got his life together, and then since then he's been able to like, because like he's definitely someone who is like a visionary and has like, just so many ideas, and he is like kind of like a prodigy and everything, but like it was just too much too fast. Yeah, right. Yeah, and I mean that's so much responsibility and like pressure with Star Wars and stuff, and like. It's almost something that I feel like that would be an important role for or job or whatever task for somebody like Kathleen Kennedy too. Is like, she's talked about it a little bit actually, and she kind of got some heat for it. And I don't really want to weigh in on the debate, but when she talked about, when were they going to have more people of color and more women directing Star Wars movies and stuff, and she was like, "You're kind of throwing somebody into I mean, this is okay." I don't know exactly what she said. I'm paraphrasing. But basically she said, like, it's a high-pressure situation, and you have to make sure somebody is ready for that and that they have kind of their career is established enough and their skills are established enough that they've done enough big stuff that they are going to be able to handle, like, the pressure of doing something like that, and also the way people are going to react to them as well. And so I just feel like part of what you have to do probably is protect, especially young people who are kind of stepping into this kind of thing a little bit. And, she might have developed that to a certain extent based on what happened with Josh Trank. Because you know what I mean? Like, although, then again, he kind of blew up before he even ever started working on Star Wars. So I guess you couldn't really lay that at her feet. But I'm sure she watched it happen. She was already working with the guy. She watched him, explode. And part of what you'd have to be concerned about when you hire people. And we might be seeing it play out with Benioff and Weiss too in a different way, but are they actually ready for this? And not only ready for it, but like, will they be able to deal with the pressure of it? Because to me, the pressure seems like it would be insane. So, and like, just but because it's who can deal with, who's really demonstrated themselves so able to deal with the pressure and even the backlash? RJ. Yes, he could do a great. Okay, sorry. Cut you off. Just because it's like thrown out there, and now that it's like in the ether, I do like that Kathy Kennedy comment about people of color and female directors and stuff. Like, I think what's frustrating about that is of the systemic racism and sexism in Hollywood, there are so few, like, it's not so few, but a minority of, high profile creators are women and people of color because of like these systemic issues. So it's like, it's kind of like the idea of like, well, you're too inexperienced for this entry level job kind of thing. Like,
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah,
how do you get the experience? And I think what Lucasfilm is doing now
With TV.
is good. Like, yes, I was gonna say first, JJ hiring a woman of color as the second unit director on The Last Jedi is big. And then also what they're doing with the TV shows, like you were saying, like bringing people in that way and getting them, acclimated to the work and the pressure.
Right.
Yeah.
And certainly it's like systemic where the system sets up the barriers, and then because of the barriers set up by the system, like it's like, okay, well now, people, like you said, people don't have the experience, or there's only so many people in Hollywood who have the track record to do something on this scale or whatever. But that's because the way that we've created the system precludes people from having that experience, and so it's like this never-ending cycle or whatever. Absolutely. The other thing too, just so quickly, and again, it's not really anything I want to focus on at the moment, but I think that the director position is the one that like gets all the publicity and the one that people focus on. But I think in the process of making a movie, and it depends on probably the production or whatever too, but there's a lot of other important roles, but it's like, well, when you announce a movie, it's like, oh, the director name is the one that like everybody focuses on and everything. But you look at Lucasfilm and like especially their like VPs and the people like really like high up in the actual Lucasfilm company, and there's been quite a bit of diversity there as far as like their initiatives and that kind of thing, that it's not the name director, and so it doesn't get the same kind of attention, which is not to make an excuse for the fact that they still are, all the Star Wars films are by white dudes, but I'm just saying like it does seem like something that they're certainly working on, and we see that in the Disney Plus shows and all those things. So and I think it's something that's important to Kathleen Kennedy and I think J.J. Abrams, and so we'll see where those things go. But anyway, to wrap up this story about Benioff and Weiss, I don't want to actually, let's just
one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
One more thing. There was also, I saw another, and it's not in the Hollywood Reporter one. I'm not sure where I saw it, but there was also some disagreement, rumored disagreement between Benioff and Weiss and Kathleen Kennedy and I would assume the Lucasfilm Story Group around the origins of the Jedi.
Yes,
as well. Like when we're actually getting into like the actual content of the film.
That as they started to meet and work together more, they saw that their ideas were on divergent paths, that they did not have the same kind of perspective on what the story should be. Yeah. So. And I'm sorry, but my confidences lie with Kathleen Kennedy and Lucasfilm Story Group and whoever else may have been involved in that. Maybe even George Lucas. I don't know.
But what if Benioff and Weiss were bringing back George's ideas?
Nah.
And they were like, no, it's too George. We can't go this. We can't go this George.
I mean, look. To tell George, sorry, it's too George, we can't go that George, is probably a really hard thing to do. And something they did with The Force Awakens, and I think it was a hard call, but the right call.
Yeah.
And so, this is probably blasphemous, but I would trust them. If George's ideas were too George and they Lucasfilm said, sorry, George, too George, I would trust them. Honestly. Especially if Benioff and Weiss were the ones who were like, we love these George ideas. And Lucasfilm was like, nah, too George. I'd be like, yeah.
The article, though, from Hollywood Reporter, it ends with like a couple paragraphs about like the state of Lucasfilm and, you know, like all that stuff and how troubled things are. And there's a quote that says this stuff needs to be sorted out before it gets to a cataclysmic point as far as like the future of Lucasfilm and all those things. And I don't know. I feel like it's a little more doom and gloom, and it's a little too focused on kind of well, they fired some people, or some people have left projects or whatever, and I don't know. I don't write for the Hollywood Reporter. I don't follow the business that closely or whatever, but I just feel like specifically it compares it to Marvel and says like, oh, Marvel's vision is so clear for its cinematic universe, but Star Wars has had trouble finding its footing. Yeah, because Marvel is making comic book movies based on comic books that are well established, and you know, they can be very independent of one another as long as they're still comic book movies set in the Marvel universe, and it doesn't have to be so. They make like 5 of them a year, and I just don't think that there's as much weight on on figuring out what they are as there is Star Wars. And so to compare the two, I feel like just is like not very fair. You know what I mean? And yeah, it's like Lucasfilm and Kathleen Kennedy and the Star Wars directors, including Benioff and Weiss, whoever is involved, Trevorrow, Trank, who people have been fired, whatever. I think their job is a lot more difficult, and just it's not even about comparing like which one's harder or not. It's about just realizing they're really different tasks, you know. I think setting a tone for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or you know, setting the direction for that versus like we have to figure out what Star Wars is, because up until now it was 6 movies overseen by one guy, 40 years apart, and now we have to try to figure out how to make this have weight like it always has been, and be important like it always has been, and feel true to what it always has been, but also go off in new directions and do it in a different way. And to compare that to, well, you know, over at Marvel they make like 5 comic book popcorn movies a year, and they don't seem to have any trouble, even though Edgar Wright got fired, even though there's been, you know, high profile failures over there too, but like I just don't think you get the same like the sky is falling mentality when changes like that take place with the Marvel stuff as you do with Star Wars. Yeah.
And I, like, you know, we're a Star Wars podcast, we're hardcore Star Wars fans. You know, and for some people, like, some people see all genre fiction goes in the same bucket. Like, there's some people do not. Like, I think a lot of people don't see a difference between Jurassic World, Game of Thrones, Avengers, and Star Wars. Like, it's all just, like, you know, it's stuff that, you know, there's toys, and it makes a ton of money, and it's super expensive to make, and it, like, you know, pushes technology. Like, it's all, you know, it's all the same.
Right.
But I think, and, you know, I think some, you know, Game of Thrones readers would, you know, had issues with the adaptation, especially in the last few seasons. But I think with Star Wars, like, there's just like there's a little bit more. I mean, you get people. Whenever there's a new Marvel movie trailer come out, you get, like, these articles that are like, oh, here's the top 8 Easter eggs that you didn't catch in the new, you know, Ant-Man trailer or whatever. Like, oh, this is a reference to, like, this issue of the comic book. Like, oh, and then that's where the discourse ends there. And then you see the movie, and then it's like, oh wow, that post-credit scene, like, that's setting up this, oh, I bet that's based off this, and then that's kind of like the end of the discourse. Again, I'm not like hardcore in the MCU community and such, but, you know, it feels a lot lighter. But then, like, with Star Wars, like, I mean, we unpack frame by frame every every second of trailers, and it's not just like us, it's every Star Wars podcast. Like, when I woke up on the morning after the Rise of Skywalker final trailer, I had like 5 podcasts of people who stayed up on a work night to, like, go through and look at every single frame and make inferences.
Mm-hmm.
Inferences both plot and theme. And I think that's kind of the difference. Where, and I'm not saying like, oh, like, like Star Wars is better art than anything else, but I mean, in the way that it resonates with me and with people like us, it is. And it is something that, like, we unpack, like, as literature. And people, are still finding, details and things to discuss in The Last Jedi. Like, people are still, talking about that film and, like, analyzing it and discussing it. And, like, and then we get stuff that, like, that Rise of Kylo Ren series that, like, gives us, like, a total paradigm shift on, like, what we thought, and it changes perspectives, and then we have to go back and, like, reanalyze other things. And I think to, like, get that right and to service the fans is much harder than just, like, oh, we're going to have, this person reveal themselves to be a villain and this character is going to die.
Yeah.
And, and then here's some, like, Easter egg references to, like, these comic books from the 70s. Like,
yeah. And like, okay, so we probably should move on to our other 2 topics here, which we're going to spend far less time on, but we should move on to those pretty quickly. But no, we are. But like, maybe I'm just drinking, maybe all of us are just drinking the Star Wars Kool-Aid or whatever, and George Lucas's Kool-Aid and all that stuff. But, like, a lot of us believe that Star Wars is modern myth, and that it is a story that is going to have resonance for decades or centuries, and that it is modern myth. And I think you could say the same thing maybe about, like, sort of Batman and Spider-Man and Superman and stuff, but not the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. Like, they are not creating modern myth. You know what I mean? Like, the stories being told through that comic book medium over the last 60 or 70 years, I think, have created a sort of form of, like, modern myth or whatever. I don't know if I would quite argue, like, to the level of Star Wars, but, maybe I'm biased in that regard. But it's not these movies that are being made right now, Like, Batman is this iconic character, and I love Tim Burton's 1989 Batman movie, but it's just, like, one Batman movie now. It's, like, one of many different versions of Batman. And, like, it doesn't have the resonance, and it doesn't have the weight and importance I don't think the movies do, which is fine. They don't have to. Like, not every new movie has to be Star Wars or whatever, and they can still be, like, they're, like, best in class, those Marvel movies. You know what I mean? They are just about as good as... I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but to me, they're excellent films and made in a really successful way for what it is, which is an adaptation of a comic book. But then a new Star Wars movie, and I'm a big Star Wars movie guy personally. Like, I read a lot of books and comics, and I love the toys and all that stuff. But, like, to me, like, the core text of Star Wars is these movies, and you're creating the mythology with these movies. And if one comes out and it sucks, it's a big deal, or if one comes out and it doesn't hit the mark, or it doesn't have weight and depth to it, it's a big deal, versus I loved Ant-Man. It was super fun. I think it's a very successful Marvel Cinematic Universe movie. I watched it once. You know what I mean? It doesn't, it's just not comparable. There's no comparison. And to be like, oh, well, they made Ant-Man without any trouble. Whoops, actually, they fired the original writer and director, and there was a bunch of trouble in it. It still turned out to be awesome, but it's the weight, the pressure, the task in front of you making that movie versus making Star Wars, or even, like, I don't know, Captain America: Winter Soldier. People love that movie, right? Like, is that really the same level of, like,
making that movie, you know, having to create that, having to get it right, like, is it really the same task? I just don't think they're really comparable, you know? So to say like, oh, well, boy, they really need to find their footing because they struggle to do this thing. Like, to me, like, the fact that The Force Awakens came out and it's amazing is like the most mind-blowing accomplishment. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The fact that like they rebooted Spider-Man for a third time and it's really good is not the most amazing accomplishment to me. It's awesome. I love those Spider-Man movies. Tom Holland Spider-Man is great, but I'm not like, oh my God, they did it. They made a Spider-Man movie and it's good. You know what I mean? But like when The Force Awakens came out, I was like, how did they do this? How did they take all these things from the past and create something new and give it this weight and value? And like, how am I tearing up at the trailer for this movie? It's just like, to me, it's just got this whole different thing. And I get kind of sick of people being like, well, Marvel's so good and they're so successful and they never have any problems. And it's like, fine, because maybe they're not struggling to accomplish the same thing that Lucasfilm is.
Yeah. And I think and this is ridiculous. We always get into this and I hate this conversation, but like once it's out there, like you can't not talk about it. But like I would say like but at the same time, like I think Lucasfilm has also been realizing that, hey, these Star Wars films, they are the primary text. These like have to like have weight. And I don't think it's just the financials of Solo that made them rethink that strategy. I think even if Solo had done, you know, $1 billion, I think like walking away from that movie and like I like the movie now. I can appreciate it for what it is, but like my initial thought was like, holy crap, that was a shallow ass Star Wars movie. Like comparatively. Yeah. And I think you know, like but then like on the other hand, I think Marvel does have stuff like Black Panther, which is like has a lot more interesting like thematic elements, and there is stuff to unpack there, and I think there's like a lot more art there.
Yeah, real quick though, could I just jump in real quick? I think I totally agree. Black Panther is like basically my favorite MCU movie. It's amazing. Yeah. It's a little different task though, or goal I think there, because like what it's doing is I think it's creating social commentary, but through a similar sort of storytelling and filmmaking as like the other Marvel movies, but it has something to say like about society now today. You know what I mean? Like it's commenting on our culture. And I feel like that's not what Star Wars does. Not to say that one is better than the other or whatever, but like Star Wars has to create these like, I feel like what Star Wars is doing is creating these like kind of epic myths that they're divorced from like time and place. They don't have anything to do with like commenting, or I shouldn't say nothing to do with. But
yeah, I wouldn't say that. Like, I mean, George is pretty clear about, you know, comparing the Emperor to Nixon, and you know the like Revenge of the Sith is pretty George W. Bush. Like there's
yes and I mean yes and no. Okay, we can't go down this road.
Yeah,
we can't.
I mean, Star Wars has always been political.
It has,
and it's always had social commentary, but it's layered in the same way like myths also had social commentary. It's not the primary focus.
Right.
That doesn't mean it's not there, but it's not like a morality tale or something for like, you know, getting kids to, you know, go to bed on time or something.
Well, yeah, and I think George looks at the Vietnam War, looks at Richard Nixon and thinks like this is one more example of this, like of you know, people's desire for power and to subjugate other people and et cetera, you know, and thinks like we see this play out in history over and over and over and over. And like, this is what's happening right now that I'm inspired by, but I'm not making a movie about the Vietnam War. Like I'm seeing what's happening in the Vietnam War and I'm pissed about it. And it's going to inspire me to tell this kind of a story.
Yeah.
But, you know, like Black Panther, and maybe it's a more important task, but it is commenting on American society and the treatment of, or the cultural politics between, different groups. And it's like very specific. And like, it's not like, well, let's just make a movie about like, sort of how like a certain character flaw that people have. No, we want to address like this situation is what Black Panther is. And so, which is awesome, and I think it was really great. But I feel like what's really cool about that, to a certain extent, is like Ryan Coogler, it's like he's able to work within the Marvel template, but then also do that. And it's awesome. But it's just still, I think, something really different than what Star Wars does.
Yeah.
So,
yep.
Still in Kathleen Kennedy, I trust. But if I don't hear that Rian Johnson is doing the movies coming out in 2022, 2024, and 2026, although I think that calendar's basically doesn't exist anymore. I think it's like pretty much made up. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure they want to get to. I'm sure they would like to have a movie out Christmas of 2022. Because if they don't, then it's just more time spent not having Star Wars movies in the theaters or whatever. But to me, that's one of those things where you hear pundits and whoever entertainment writers saying, well, Marvel always goes and does their little showing, and they always put their calendar up there, and they show everybody what's coming out, and how come Star Wars doesn't do that? And it's like, I think they were like, okay, fine, we should do that because everybody wants us to. And then guess what? It was a stupid idea. You should not have done that. They don't know what they're doing and when it's happening.
Make sense. Yeah.
And I will take their messy, big swings, sometimes missing, trying to do something incredible over a smooth, operation, putting out predictable, more shallow entertainment. Like everybody who's writing
both. Yeah.
But everybody who's writing about how, I'm just saying everybody who's writing about how Lucasfilm can't just like clockwork put out no drama movies on a predictable production cycle, whatever. It's like, I think it's evidence that what they're doing is on a different level personally, and that it's messy and hard to get it done.
Yeah.
But I know one thing they could really do, which is hire Rian Johnson, and then they could get it done more predictably. Sorry, just to wrap it up, because we really should move on to these other two things and then get out of here. But I think your point is it makes so much sense as far as like Solo, and I think Rogue One's a weird outlier because it is like a standalone movie, but it's closer to a saga movie in terms of how much depth and heart it has and stuff. But just
there's that term again. Heart.
Yeah, well, I don't care. I'm fine with being subjective about Star Wars, but but Disney Plus is just like, it's like a perfect place for stuff like Solo. You know what I mean? And the Mandalorian and a Boba Fett movie. Like, really, a Boba Fett movie? I don't know. I mean, even the Obi-Wan show. And Obi-Wan's one of these saga characters, whatever. But like the story they're going to tell about Obi-Wan Kenobi, like, should it sit on screen in a movie theater next to episodes 1 through 9, or does it make more sense as like a TV show? I think they rightfully came to the conclusion, wait a minute, maybe this stuff makes more sense on TV. And I think it would have been true for Solo. Although Solo's like the Indiana Jones Star Wars movie, which is, but that's not Indiana. I love Indiana Jones, but it's not quite the same thing as Star Wars, right? And so maybe you protect the thing that is a Star Wars movie by moving this stuff to TV, like you pointed out, Ryan. And then that makes so much more sense. And then not only that, to just put a bow on it, and we got to move on, but just to put a bow on it, would it have made more sense for Dan and Dave to just do a Star Wars TV show? I think that could have been a lot better plan too, but I don't know. Let's move on to an actual Star Wars TV show.
Okay.
Because there's this new Mandalorian trailer. We don't have that much to say about it.
No.
We're not breaking it down shot by shot.
No. It is a trailer aimed at the 18 to 45 male demographic, and it is successful in that regard.
Yeah. And it really recycles a lot of like imagery and stuff that we've seen in other trailers. I think it's just more of a, hey, let's get people aware of the show, and Disney Plus launches in a couple weeks, and so let's make sure people remember that and whatnot. But it's all just cool action sequences primarily, right? I mean,
Yeah. It reminds me of a Marvel trailer.
yeah.
Like, because it's basically people are like, oh, that looks badass. And, oh, here's a couple references to some old things. And then everyone just moved on.
Yes.
Like,
yeah. No, I think you're right. It doesn't, even within like the Star Wars, fan community or whatever, it doesn't have the kind of, I mean, nobody would expect it to, but it doesn't have the kind of resonance that like the Rise of Skywalker trailer has because, well, number one, it doesn't really give us anything new, but yeah, it's very plot driven. It's very like cool action sequence driven.
Mm-hmm. A lot of gun poses.
Yep, a lot of cool heroic tough guy gun poses, whatever. I loved your text to me as soon as it was over, which was basically to say it's so so masculine, which is pretty much true. And yeah, I mean, there's some beautiful shots. There's some really cool stuff. But again, mostly all things I've seen already. I always crack up at the shot where Cara Dune and the Mando do the like, ooh, like high five thing, like they, like bro up. You know what I mean? Like, that whole moment is pretty funny.
I love it.
You get the cool. The one thing in here that I think is new and pretty interesting is the woman who puts her hands up to the Mandalorian's helmet, puts her hands on his helmet, and it's like, what's going on in that sequence? And it definitely indicates the idea that I'm just going to go for it, Ryan, that maybe there's more heart to the Mandalorian.
Oh my God.
than we would have otherwise maybe thought. So, it also, who's this actor? Do you know the shot I'm talking about towards the end? There's a guy in like a red room, and he's got like a bald head like me, and he's got like guns. He's got like two blasters.
Yeah.
He's even got one up on his shoulder.
He's got
blaster.
He's like General Grievous, but with guns.
Yeah, but like I know, I recognize the guy. I don't know the actor's name, and I can't remember what he's been in before. But I mean, like if I didn't know I was looking at a TV show, like seeing this guy is like, oh, this is a TV actor right here. You know what I mean? And I'm sure he's been in a million movies. I'm sure he has, but it looks so television, And I think the Mandalorian's going to have.
It's so EU.
No, it looks so EU. Exactly.
It's
yes,
so EU.
Totally. It's the difference between a character you see in a Star Wars movie on screen and a character you see airbrushed on the cover of a Star Wars novel. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of what it looks like there. Yeah. And I'm not upset about that. I'm laughing about it.
I'm not
It's
either.
fun.
Like I love the EU and I'm super stoked for this show, but it's a very different thing.
Yeah, and I think that it's based on all the reactions people have had to seeing it, seeing the footage that they've seen so far, and based on some of the comments and stuff, I think there will be more to it than this trailer indicates, I think, but I bet it'll be similar to like a Clone Wars or a Star Wars Rebels or whatever, where it's like, yeah, those shows, like they definitely bring in some of the mythic, like deep storytelling of like a Star Wars movie or whatever, but it's just in a really different way and on a different level, because there are moments in Star Wars Rebels where I'm so moved by the story of the Ghost Crew and, all that stuff. But then there's also just tons of episodes where it's like, here's the Ghost Crew doing the Ghost Crew thing. You know what I mean? And it's like, you can't compare it to a Star Wars movie. It's not the same thing. And I don't think this will be either. I mean, I think it's going to look great because I'm sitting here saying like it looks like such a TV show in this shot or whatever. But overall, I think it's going to look really good. I think it's going to be great. But I just can't like rip apart this trailer and be all analytical about it in the same way that I would with a Saga movie trailer.
Yeah.
What does he say at the end here, though? It's a good line from The Mandalorian, from Pedro Pascal.
Yeah. It's a very like action movie line.
Yeah, good. I forget what Werner Herzog said to him to make him say that, but it was a badass tough guy line there.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the same as like in the footage we saw at Celebration where he's like, I like those odds.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, it's like total, yeah. It is what it is. Like, it's fine. I think, I'm gonna like watch the crap out of this show. Like, I'm probably gonna watch episodes multiple times. Like, I'm so excited for this. I've been buying the toys. I'm amped. Like, but it's not the same way that I'm going to like sit down and unpack The Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah. No, definitely not. That being said, I think when the first episode comes out, or when any episode comes out, but like when the episodes air and we're watching them, I think there will be plenty to say about them, and there'll be plenty probably to dig into and talk about, like as far as like the actual episodes are concerned. But the imagery in the trailer and stuff, or just like what the trailer, I don't know. Yeah, it's a different thing, as we've definitely kind of hammered home here at this point. But
and that's cool.
Yeah.
Like, Star Wars can be a lot of different things, but at the end of the day, there's, like you were saying, there's the primary texts, and those are sacred. Those are the sacred Jedi texts.
Yeah. I think the show's going to deliver in a lot of cool stuff, though. Last thing I guess, as we kind of move on here, but just watching the end of the trailer again, and like the Mandalorian, zip lining his way onto the TIE fighter that Giancarlo Esposito is flying there, and like kind of being up on top of it, Anakin Skywalker in Coruscant style, like I'm gonna open up the hatch of your TIE fighter or whatever. It's pretty cool. I think there's gonna be some really cool stuff. So.
There's good. It's definitely gonna have like a lot of cool moments.
Yeah, and this news has been out there for a couple weeks, but I didn't realize until you kind of texted me that calendar, I think from Star Wars Explained earlier in the week, but in 2 weeks, or a little less than, actually just a little over a week now, I think, when the Tuesday when the first episode comes out, November 12th, that's when that first episode drops, but then the second episode drops just like, 3 days later on a Friday, 4 days later, 3 days later on a Friday there, so we'll get 2 episodes the first week. That'll be awesome, and then pretty much weekly episodes from there, so gonna be exciting stuff.
That's interesting.
Yeah. All right. So to wrap the show up here, Ryan, tell us about your experience going to see Knives Out at the Denver International Film Festival, I think it's called.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I'm not going to spoil anything about the film, because that would be the worst thing I could do to anyone, not even in broad strokes. But so the actual experience was... I watched Knives Out in a packed opera house auditorium. It's the same auditorium where I saw Book of Mormon live. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the environment was, and it was pretty amazing. I'm a hardcore Alamo Drafthouse Draconian theater moviegoer. Like, I want like fascism in my theaters, basically. Like, no one talks, no one turns on cell phones. Like, if you have a cough, you stifle it for 2 hours, and like,
you want to go to Kylo Ren's movie theater.
Yeah, basically. Like, no, I'm like a total fascist when it comes to like movie theaters, because I want that like pure experience. Like, I don't want to be like, oh, this movie was good, but like, God, these people behind us wouldn't shut up, and like everything. And like, this was it was, I knew going into it was going to be almost an impossible task for the sheer number of people. Like, it was like 3 stories of film goers. It's the most people I've ever seen a movie with. And it's just in this like ginormous space, with, theater acoustics, like theater acoustics. Yeah. And so like I was, I kind of just like resigned myself to it, but it actually like in some ways it like really enhanced the experience, because like, though it's a movie, like I don't know, I don't care like what you think of Rian Johnson or Last Jedi or anything. Like, it's a movie that will elicit reactions at like, it demands your attention basically, and will just consistently elicit reactions. And like, the people were reacting the whole time, and I mean consistently, and it was such a fun experience. And then like after the film, because it is deep. Like, the one thing I will say about it is, like, it's a fun movie. It is also a dense and complicated movie, but, like, at its core, it's moment to moment, it's fun.
Okay.
But yeah. And then
can I ask you one question about it then?
Yeah.
Nothing to do with details or whatever, but I really feel like one of my biggest initial takeaways from The Last Jedi, and by initial I mean like after watching it 2 or 3 times, is like, oh, I didn't totally not get isn't the right word, but like this movie necessitated multiple viewings for me to completely comprehend it. Like, you can't watch The Last Jedi once and then, I feel like I couldn't anyway, watch it once and confidently kind of weigh in on it, because it required more than one viewing. Is Knives Out a similar type of thing, you think, where it's like multiple viewings are going to be maybe required to completely take it all in?
I think you can get the totality of it in one viewing.
Like, you'll know how you feel about it. You'll know what your kind of reaction to it is.
Mm-hmm. But then you will want to see it again.
Okay.
Like Lindsay and I immediately after leaving is like, okay, when do we get to go see this at Alamo?
Yeah.
Like, when does the Blu-ray come out? Because, like, it's dense.
Yeah.
And it's, there's a lot of thrown expectations, but there's also, like, if you're okay, I'm not saying anymore.
Okay. All right. Okay. So then you went to the party afterwards.
Well, no, then immediately after, they presented Ryan with the John Cassavetes Award for being real good at making movies. And Ryan was like, as if you've ever seen an interview with him, like, he was so, like, humble and charming and down to earth about it and everything. And then after that, an interviewer with from the Denver Post, like, they pulled out 2 chairs onto the stage, and they just had a Q&A between them. So, like, part of it was like, because Ryan grew up here in Denver. And so part of it was, like, talking about, like, the city and, like, how it's changed and stuff like that. But then, like, there was also, like, a part where, like, the dude asked, like, one question about, like, hey, it doesn't seem like there's many, like, whodunits these days. And then Ryan's like, wait, and, like, went through and, like, listed, like, 30 from, like, the past, like, year, and was just like, oh man, you gotta see this and, like, this, and then it was, like, going on about, like, just totally geeking out about, like, old whodunits and stuff. And, like, he basically was just like, okay, if you liked my movie, then here's 50 movies you need to, like, go home and watch.
Yeah, he knows movies, huh?
Yeah, which just, like, and it was just such, like, raw, like, nerdy enthusiasm that, like, it was so, like, sincere and endearing. And then, like, then there was, like, obviously some Star Wars questions around that, and that's where he, sort of talked about, like, how Knives Out was fun because it was, done in a year as opposed to, like, Star Wars, which takes longer. He did not talk about anything in the future, which, I don't think, like, the audience there was not there for, like, Star Wars news.
Yeah.
But
okay.
Yeah, and then after that, we went to the after party, which was down the street at so I had been to this building once before. We went there for Dink, which is an independent comic convention. It's like I don't know, like the like high, like the indie comic scene. And I'm not saying like, oh, this was like an independent comic convention, like where like, oh, some people just like, you know, got a bunch of you know, Marvel and DC writers here. Like it's the indie comic scene, like the people working outside of
like
and
the comic
sometimes
convention,
within.
like the comic convention from Chasing Amy.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay.
There you go.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right.
So yeah, we had gone there before, but like this is also like an place for like art installations and art shows, and there was like tons of art up on the walls that was like for sale. There was a Misfits inspired piece that I was like, oh, that's awesome. And then like I noticed it was $11,000, and so like you could kind of like, that's just scene setting.
Yeah.
And so we get to this like party. I've never been to something like this before. But there's a live band playing. There's a murder mystery game happening where there's people in, you know, masks that you have to like go get clues from, and like you have to share clues with other party goers. It's like it was like a mingling activity, but it was like very theatrical at the same time, because like the you know, the everyone was like wearing like full costumes, and like I think it was a lot of like maybe Denver theater people who were doing this because like they were, you know, talking in accents and using voices, and so like it was interesting. And then it was an open bar, and including a Francis Ford Coppola wine booth, which was exciting. And so here's my my one story. Most of the like, I was mostly like, wow, this is really cool. Also, like, I feel super out of place here. But then like I like didn't talk to anyone except Lindsay the whole time, and she was like playing the game, so she was like going around and talking to people and stuff, and I was like mostly just like hanging out with a drink. And then at one point someone came in, and they were dressed up in like Jedi robes and had a lightsaber, and I was like, oh man, this is the person. This is the person like I've been waiting to talk to all night, because I just watched Knives Out.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh man, like let's go deep. Like let's do this. Let's talk Last Jedi. Let's talk Knives Out. Let's talk similarities. Like let's talk Rian Johnson. And so like I go up to this guy, and I was like, "Oh, did you enjoy the film?" And he's like, "Oh, I didn't go to the movie. I'm just here for the party." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, like I assumed, like, you know, you're dressed up like in Star Wars stuff. Like I didn't know if it was, you know, like Rian Johnson, Last Jedi to like Knives Out, you know."
Yeah.
And he's like, "No."
Okay.
And I was like, "Okay, bye."
Does he just go to all parties in a Jedi robe then, or like what's the?
Well, it was Halloween.
Oh, that's true. Okay, that's true.
So
That's
like
true.
people were dressed up, but I was like, okay, well, not really going to get to talk Star Wars with anyone
Yeah.
here
Well,
tonight.
and obviously, then Rian Johnson was not at the party, right?
I mean, at the time that we left, he was not there.
Gotcha.
So,
Right. Okay.
but
All right. Well, that sounds awesome. I'm very jealous that you were able to go to that. Knives Out did play at the Chicago Film Festival in October as well. Ryan was there. Would have been a tough thing for me to get to, though, as that's at that time of day that I would have had to have left to go to it, like a 2-hour drive, and
it was a work night and etc. So kind of bummed I didn't do it, but I am happy that you were able to do that, Ryan. That sounds amazing. I got to wait a couple more weeks to see Knives Out. But real quick, on the way out the door here, an article was posted on Deadline last night. Headline, Rian Johnson says he's still in talks for more Star Wars and that angry Last Jedi tweets helped inspire Knives Out. So he says, anyone who's on Twitter these days, God bless you, because it's rough waters out there, but there's also wonderful stuff about it. That's why we're all still on it, I guess. That's one of the things Knives Out engages with, the current state of online culture. Whether you made a Star Wars movie or you have a cooking show, whatever you're doing on there, someone's going to be screaming at you about it probably. Let's put it on a screen in a way we can all maybe have a laugh about. And he also said, as far as Knives Out goes, what we try and do is place it in the modern day. That for me meant not just skinning it with cell phones, modern cars, and music. That meant actually plugging it into 2019. We do character types who are slight caricatures of the type Agatha Christie used to do, but with people who, for better or worse, you could only meet in 2019. That all sounds really smart and funny and engaging, and I know that there's more that you want to say that you won't say now because you don't want to ruin anything, so thank you for that, Ryan. All that being said, the Star Wars part of this is this quote here in the middle, where Johnson added, he is still in talks with Lucasfilm to make more Star Wars films, though he had no news about them. We're still engaged with Lucasfilm, and we'll wait and see. No updates on it at this moment, but yeah. Okay, so there's the quote from Rian Johnson there. Man, I read a quote like that, and my initial reaction is like, I just want you to say, hell yes, I'm doing more Star Wars. It's happening. Can't wait. The more I see these kinds of comments, because you had sent us an article, I don't have it up right now, but you had sent us an article or a quote from Rian Johnson a few weeks ago where he was like, oh, did I say I'm maybe doing it? Whoops. Or like basically like he had a quote a month or two ago that kind of had us all going, uh-oh, maybe he's not doing the movies anymore. And then not too long after that, someone asked him about that quote, and he was like, oh, geez, I didn't mean to do that. You know what I mean? And now he has a quote that says, we're still talking about it, but I can't update you on it at the moment. So my initial reaction is to be like, oh my God, I'm nervous. Maybe he's not doing it anymore, or maybe like Lucasfilm is being like very, I don't know, Ryan, we're not sure we want you to do it. But then the more and more I think about it, the more I'm looking at a quote like that, and I'm thinking, okay, they made the deal to do more Star Wars movies with Rian Johnson before The Last Jedi was even out. They love Rian Johnson. They worked well with him. The movie's controversial with some people, but it made a ton of money, and I think overall is a big success. And it's kept people talking Star Wars, even if some of them are angry, right? Because we talked about Game of Thrones and how it just disappeared from the discourse. Like the fact an online war about The Last Jedi is not the best thing in the world. Like I'm kind of sick of it, like ultra sick of it. But at the same time, like it's a movie that has staying power. It matters to people whether they love it or hate it, and I think overall it's a success. I know some people listening would argue that, but I think it is. Anyway, I feel like what's happening is Lucasfilm is trying to get its life right now as far as these movies go. They just had to get rid of Benioff and Weiss. Episode 9 is on the horizon. I was kind of thought it was weird when they announced that Rian Johnson was doing more movies before The Last Jedi even came out, because it was like a month beforehand, and it was like, I would think you'd want to just keep the conversation on The Last Jedi. But I suppose, you know, if you're really confident in somebody, you let people know before the movie comes out how confident you are in them. That's going to give them confidence in the movie you have coming out. So maybe it makes sense. But anyway, it's a long way of saying I think it's happening for sure. And I think that even though it's weird because they already said, yeah, we're doing these movies. They said it in 2017. But now I think it's a thing where it's like we want to really nail everything down and get episode 9 out. And then sometime next year, I think they're going to be kind of like, okay, here's the vision. Here's what we're doing. And I think they just kind of don't want him talking about it until it's really concrete. You know what I mean? Like when and how and where and all that kind of stuff. Because some of these answers are so cagey where it's like, well, we'll see what happens. I don't know, you know. But I think we just had, in fact, we just had the interviews with Ewan Mcgregor this week where he's like, God, it's so awkward to be asked about, are you going to be Obi-Wan Kenobi, and have to lie about it for years because that's what they want you to do, because they want, you know, they want to have a concrete
pieces to fall into place first. Yeah.
So that's where I'm at with all these Rian Johnson comments, because it gives me a lot of anxiety, to be honest with you, every time I see a new quote from him about his Star Wars movies and whether or not they're happening, because they're never like, hell yeah. They were like, but see, that's what's weird about it too, because they were like 6 months ago. Like when he was at that cinema convention in Vegas showing the trailer for Knives Out, and he's like, and then I'll be returning to a galaxy far, far away. And he was like, here's what I'm doing. And now it's a little more like, I don't know. And I guess like it's a 50-50 thing, because it could be because they're not sure if he's doing it, or it could be a thing where like I'm hoping that it's them telling him, hey, let's not talk about it until things are a little more concrete.
Yeah, I think the original plan when they announced him doing the movies before Last Jedi was before the it was before Last Jedi, it was before Solo, and it was before Iger coming out and saying like, we're gonna scale back Star Wars in the theater. So like that was probably at the point where they were still planning on having a new Star Wars movie every year. And obviously that's not happening now. So I think like with Ryan, I think it's not a question of if, but of when. And I mean, there's
Benioff and Weiss leaving, it seems like maybe that question would be getting cleared up right now, right?
Yeah. I think Celebration next year.
Ooh, man, are they going to keep me guessing until then?
Find out. Yeah.
You think so?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe.
I mean, because like
because that also means keeping investors guessing and keeping all these people who write articles about is Star Wars in trouble at the Hollywood Reporter and stuff, that keeps them guessing too. And like, how important is Celebration in comparison to what the media is saying about Star Wars and its troubled waters or whatever?
Well, let them talk. Let them
eat cake, huh? Marie Antoinette?
No, she didn't say that, but that's a misquote. Oh. But no, like Rise of Skywalker is going to be some level of financial success. It's going to people are going to be like, oh wow, Star Wars. Okay, yeah, maybe like the doom and gloom was a little ridiculous. People are going to be talking about that movie and watching that movie a ton, and yeah, I think the buzz is crazy. It's the biggest thing this holiday for sure. I mean, I don't know if it's not. I don't think it's going to do Force Awakens numbers. Mm-hmm. It may not even. It will probably do something close to Last Jedi numbers.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's going to be above or below, but it'll be it'll do well. And then and I think like that's enough for a while. Like that will be where people will be like, okay, Star Wars is fine. Like Mandalorian is going to, like, even people who like hate the sequel trilogy and stuff, like Mandalorian is going to be for those people and for us. But I think like that's gonna get more people back on board. I think the video game is going to get more people on board. Like Star Wars is gonna have a good holiday. It's gonna be able to ride that wave through the first part of the year, and then by the time Celebration rolls around, I think the point of having a celebration 1 year after is to be like, okay, here's the future of Star Wars.
Okay, could be. I'm with you in a lot of ways. I would place my money on they start talking or they make some kind of announcement about Rian Johnson and the movies that he's going to make earlier in the year than Celebration, but then they do like a conversation with him or something at Celebration where they actually probably can't, I mean, they're not going to talk too much about it, but sort of do like what you're saying is like sort of use Celebration to kind of tell Star Wars fans like, where are we going? You know what I mean? But if it's coming out in 2022,
also. Like, I think he'll be working on it before Celebration, of course. And I think that, yeah, I just feel like they would want the world to know and the entertainment industry to know that, yes, there is a plan, and yes, we are doing something as far as Star Wars goes and what it is they're doing. And I think that's a different thing than communicating with like the fans, which you're probably right. They will do that. Hopefully they'll do that at Celebration. They'd have to, about the future of Star Wars. But yeah, I mean, Celebration hopefully is going to be Cassian Andor. It's going to be Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's going to be like looking back at the sequel trilogy. There's going to be a lot of stuff at Celebration, but I think then also, yeah, hopefully a conversation with Rian Johnson would be great. One of the best things I've gone to in Star Wars Celebration history is the Future Filmmakers panel I went to on Sunday morning in 2015, which turned out to just be with Gareth Edwards. It was supposed to be Josh Trank and Gareth Edwards, but it was just a conversation with Gareth Edwards about Rogue One. And I mean, they haven't filmed a single shot of that movie yet. You know, they were getting ready to go shoot pretty soon, so they'll be farther along than Rian Johnson will be, if it's all shaking out the way we hope it will. But still, it was just like, we're just talking about what the vision is for the movie. Not character names, I don't think, nothing really specific, you know. So I would love if they did a panel like that with Rian Johnson, where it's just like, let's just sit down and pick your brain and talk about like what you hope to do with your Star Wars movies, in a very general sense. I think that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
But I think they could do that without, and still announce like, okay, he is doing the movies, and this is when they're coming out earlier in the year.
Yeah, and I mean, they could just say, like, they could have the press release that's, like, the first of Ryan's new era of Star Wars movies comes out in December 2022.
Yeah.
And, like, they could have that and then, like, go a little more into it at Celebration.
That being said, one of the things that's easy to criticize them for is announcing things and then having to fire people or not follow through with them or whatever. So I guess there's not too big of an incentive of announcing it, you know, earlier than you need to. And it's a weird thing because it's already been announced. They announced it in 2017, but now it's like, well, what's happening? So, God, I hope we're right. I just hope we're right that it's still happening, and the caginess is because we've gone back into down low mode, and we're not publicly talking yet. Like in 2017, things were gravy. Everybody was excited. Yep, that's what we're going to do. We're doing all kinds of things. We're doing a movie. You get a movie. You get a movie. You get a movie. We're doing movies all over the place. Now we've really dialed that back. It doesn't mean we're moving away from working with you, but it means we're moving away from talking about this stuff. We're in lockdown mode. Yeah. And you can talk about it.
We're talking about The Mandalorian. We're talking about Jedi Fallen Order. We're talking about The Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah.
That's where things are at right now.
That is what I want to believe. Yeah. So
I think that's absolutely what's happening.
I mean, that's what my gut tells me. Yeah. It makes the most sense to me, especially with Benioff and Weiss being out the door. It's like she said, Kathleen Kennedy said earlier in the year at Celebration, she said, oh yeah, next month we're going to have a sit down. I forget what they called it, but we're going to have a sit down, like Rian Johnson, Benioff and Weiss, us, we're going to talk about the future of Star Wars. Wouldn't be shocked if things started to go south there. You know what I mean?
God, I would love to have been a fly on the wall for that.
With the people who were just announced as out the door, I think. But that's, you know. And Kathleen Kennedy's going to be talking in December when these movies come out. People will be asking her questions, so maybe she'll be able to say, and Bob Iger will be talking in December when these movies come out, or when the movie comes out. So maybe at that point they'll be a little more like, hey, Ryan's our guy. You know, we're still definitely working with Ryan, but we're not talking anything more specific than that right now. You know, maybe they'll say those kinds of things to reassure us. But I think if you're Rian Johnson at this point, you're kind of like, yeah, we're not, I don't know, you know, can't really talk about it. So,
well, I will say he hasn't announced another project, I don't believe.
That's true. Although he did announce a new production company, like him and Bergman. So we'll see. But even when that happened, he was like, yeah, I'm still doing Star Wars, but, you know, maybe I'll do one more movie and then Star Wars, or maybe I'll go right to Star Wars. So it does kind of seem like for a long time, it's the plan has been, you know, I'm doing more Star Wars, but there's some play as far as when it's going to happen. So hopefully that, you know, doesn't mean anything. It shouldn't be concerning, because if that's always been kind of the talk, like we want you to do it, but, you know, we'll have to figure out when.
Yeah, I mean, you on his IMDb right now, he has Knives Out 2019, and the only thing above it is Untitled Star Wars Trilogy, Episode 1.
Wow. Nice. All right. Cool. Well, I guess it's an exciting time because we've got like some great stuff coming out. We've got Mandalorian. We've got Rise of Skywalker on the way. There's a lot of good things happening. And I think, maybe the Force had to balance itself out a little bit in removing Benioff and Weiss the way it has before with certain other creators. Sorry to them.
Benioff and Weiss-demption.
Yes, but I mean, they can console themselves with the $250 million deal they have at Netflix, and it sounds like they want it out, and that's a sad thing, I'm sure, for them. But it does sound like they want it out, or maybe Lucasfilm is just generously putting it that way. But I don't know. I mean, when Trevor, no, we're moving on. We're ending. But when Trevor left, there was no hours. Everybody knew what the score was. You know what I mean? This seems a little more. Maybe they really did just decide to walk away for complex reasons. But anyway, we're going to walk away for simple reasons. One simple reason being that we're already over 2 hours and it's time to go. So if you're still here, thank you for sticking with us. We will be back soon with another episode of the Blockade Runner Podcast. Until then, you can check out everything we do at blockaderunnerpodcast.com. You can email us at blockaderunnerpodcast@gmail.com or interact with us on Twitter. The account for the show is at Blockade Run. And Ryan, your personal account is
at Brawn Dwarf, BRAWNDWARF.
All right, so thanks very much for watching and or listening, and we will be back soon with more Blockade Runner Podcast.